This is the book, Black Sheep. I'm Robert Covelli. This is available through Baker & Taylor and Ingram's and online and at my website, which is fictionpolitical.com. The book is set in a Rust Belt city, which is Buffalo, New York, called the Rust Belt because it was once a center of manufacturing and commerce, and the manufacturing pulled out. The book is set in the 90s, when the 1990s, the end of the last century, when Buffalo was beginning to rebound and come back and rebuild itself. The section that I'm going to read is pretty brief. It's about 3/4 of the way through the book, and it involves people that you won't know because you have not read it. The first is an African American man named Richard. He is an activist. He has dabbled in some criminal activities because that's the money that there was to be made in a depressed economy. The second is a Latina woman. She's Puerto Rican. She is also an activist. She was much more involved in criminal activity and pulled herself out. The third is a waitress, a white woman. She works in the diner where these two activists are meeting to discuss trying to come together to work together. And this woman was married to a guy who worked at one of the automobile factories that also pulled out of town in Buffalo, and this woman's life just fell to pieces. You will hear very briefly a man mentioned. His name is Andrew Ross. He's just a nice man who got involved in some of the ugly things going on, and they will mention him briefly. Another man is an Italian guy who is very involved in crime, and his name is Buon Parole, which is Italian actually for the good word. Kind of a perverse pun on Christian theology. He is trying to take over criminal activities in Buffalo away from a more established criminal family. And the only reason that's important is that there is mention of conflict. And they're not talking about the war in Afghanistan. It's a war right there in town. That's what they're talking about. One last thing, there are two offensive words that will come into this, and those words are nigger and spick. And they are used by the black and Latino woman as they think and speak about how other people are looking at them. So just know that that is. This section is called Consensus. Emily Sandoval chose to meet Richard Hightower in Ruby's sandwich shop on Main Street. Ruby's was a hot spot at lunchtime, and clean picture windows offered lunchers a view of the sidewalk and passers-by a view of often harried people eating lunch. Emily wasn't harried, at least not by a work schedule. She and her councilman's staff had been sweet-talking Spanish realtors, doctors, bankers, teachers, et al., looking in Buffalo's struggling middle class for people who were willing to get involved. She had found more than she expected, far more. Now, she and her councilman were anxious to include Richard and his people in a coalition. They were typically adversaries. A short lady in sharp mind, Emily wore a flowing white blouse that flattered her waist and breasts and ruffled up the center of her chest. Her sexy black stretch pants and black leather sash embellished her dark eyes and flowing dark hair. Her black patent leather shoes, pointing to a glorious future in the toe, were, as part of this outfit, beyond discussion. She didn't wait long to be seated. Nor was business slow. She slid into a booth along the wall and back, and the crowd bulged at the door. Her councilman had asked Richard to join her, and she was pleased to see the black man walk to the host station and point to the booth where she sat. The truth was that Emily was excited, almost beyond enduring. The Hispanic lady stood up and greeted her counterpart in the Afro-American community. She labored to contain her Latin emotions. Emily wanted to squash the black dude in her arms. But instead, the Puerto Rican gal offered her associate a seat, and her sense of wonder collapsed into a softly sinful grin. A city smile conceived of sunsets over tenements and first kisses on summer nights. She took in Richard with a long, warm glance. He wore a maroon knit shirt over a pair of classy khaki pants that were pleated on his thigh. He trimmed his mustache, his gray mustache. His gray hair was cut short. Emily liked his height and the breadth of his shoulders. His belly bulged a bit, which she found sexy somehow. He had on new leather work boots, and Emily liked that, as though he had come to honor honest labor. The black guy was something of an institution in Buffalo, and when he sat down, Emily felt a thrill. It was wild. Across the table, his dark face gaped at her, amused and ironical. What you think's gonna happen today? Emily couldn't speak. This had happened to her when she read books about the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Her councilman had loaned her the books in her youth. He'd earned a master's degree in political science from Syracuse University, and he had courted her when he saw how much she cared. He had watched her sink into crime and pull herself out again. And in truth, Emily committed herself to serving him as to a calling. She wanted to tell Richard all of it, but she couldn't catch her breath. It had happened when the church confirmed her too. Emily believed that Catholicism welcomed her into a liberation theology of which she wasn't even aware, but she had felt a spirit of human becoming and distinctly worldly change. Her early prayers had been whispered in awe. Now Emily heard a baby chattering in the next booth, and she smiled at his mom, who was feeding him with a spoon, trying to get a bite of a sandwich, and converse with another woman who sat across the booth. And Emily longed to include those two women in her dialogue with Richard Hightower, but she couldn't find words. She couldn't find words because the same thing had happened when she met Buonparole, but she had betrayed Buonparole to survive. When the truth struck her, Emily felt her enthusiasm wane. Her heart constricted, but she found breath, and then she found words. She realized what she had to say before she could talk shop. I watched life grind to a halt, Emily said. Her voice grew dry like slag in a steel mill. The machinery broke. I saw movements die. All these high old times never paid my rent for 25 years, and recessions crushed us every time. Her eyes watered. Her throat closed. She glanced away, studying the mommy and the baby at the next table. The people, she asked? The people stayed the same. Government didn't provide. Upward mobility? Huh. I've waited 25 years for sense to emerge from madness. She bowed her head. The madness my dreams of happiness became. I felt, she said, looking up and curling her lips, reaching in the air for the right word. Stained. Her face despaired. When she had met him, Buonparole felt like salvation, and today Emily suffered a horror that the spirited man she knew, that back alley preacher of power named Buonparole, must feel stained as well, stain caused by stagnation, and she said that to Richard. It's stagnation, and it's a tacky whore. A cheap hooker who spreads disease and leaches spirit and laughs. Emily tossed her head and blew a lungful of guilty shame into the air. Huh. Richard lowered his eyes, and Emily wondered if he trusted her. Something come together, Richard said, trying to persuade her. And that's a lot for a hustler like me to admit. This country is shook up, and I ain't even sure it's my country. She felt his scrutiny of her like religion and law. Some parts fell by the way, others tried to hide. A lot of them grabbed as much as they could and covered their asses. Emily was nodding, but she was also wondering what else is new, wondering if he had come to hustle her. But then he continued, and Emily blinked and bit her lip. His voice was softer. Some ground got solid, you know? This technology stuff, All this economic pain, the distance of parties and political machines from people, all that shit set us back. But something is real now. The people are kicking, and the leaders are dashing to catch up. Emily felt him take a breath and study her, whose people had long been his desperate rivals. He said, I understand how you feel. Richard was silent for a long time. You reached down into me when you called and lit up something deep in there. He licked his lips and stared at her. Could it be? He wondered softly. His face softened and Emily had to swallow. I'm a bad man from mean streets, he murmured, but I was a religious child, raised by the banks of Baptist waters. His eyes moistened. He wavered his head. Could it be hope? Then he dumbfounded her. Richard laughed, wiping a hard palm over his cheeks and chin, which she figured he had shaven smooth for her. Oh man, he mumbled. Is it possible the time has come? Right now, all I want is a cup of coffee with you. I'd like a piece of apple pie with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. When he murmured, that ain't too much to ask, Emily felt threatened by tears. Thinking about herself, a high-strung girl. Always moving, always thinking, always nervous. This afternoon in Ruby's on Main Street, Emily relaxed into grace, which scared her. A haggler by trade, she didn't trust calm. Veteran of Buffalo streets, she would hardly feel at ease downtown, but now she knew that she had beat her canny self at her own game. Without warning, her cushioned seat sabotaged her. The comfort of it comforted her. A barrio chick, she felt as if she had arrived. Creative stasis was unnerving. She could visualize progress again. She felt possibilities that she had long repressed with vengeance. Her silence felt prolific. How's Andrew Ross? She asked at last, and Richard smiled. He's okay. I'm sorry he got hurt, said Emily gently. I couldn't help him. I know, Richard answered. Your people didn't hurt him. Then Emily's face opened up like a Bible under a brilliant window. Her little fist clenched for a moment and her teeth shone. My people are down with this, she said. She leaned back her head and wonder glowed about her. The process is in motion, she said, as if she couldn't believe it. This is happening. We're going to nominate a progressive. The convention is tomorrow night. Our candidate is gonna be nominated. The Democratic Party is gonna run a progressive for mayor. Response came very softly. I know. Money's on the table, Emily said, for jobs, as if that were incomprehensible. She leaned forward, glancing over her shoulder. If the war doesn't expand. Reply was soft. I know. Emily saw a waitress coming, pulling a pencil out of purplish hair and a check pad out of her apron, and she heard Richard murmur, we got to hold on to hope, my friend. He laughed quietly, shaded laughter that Emily recognized from the humor of alleys, a derision born of horrors. She wondered why he laughed like that. Then she found out. A lot of people who've been loyal to Malvolio, he said, aren't giving up easy. I heard stories from my barber. A shipping clerk in Black Ridge walked into a gun battle on his landing dock at 6 o'clock in the morning over something in the back of a truck. You hear what I'm saying? Then yuppies almost wrecked their speedboat on the lake. He rose both hands as though this, as Emily knew, was obvious. It was midnight. It was gunfire between a private plane and some trawler chugging north by Fredonia. He grinned subtly. The worst was kids in Bowmansville watching a manhunt in Ellicott Creek. The kids bet on the guys running away. He leaned back and laughed. They were dressed better. Richard stopped talking and laid his dark hands flat down where the waitress leaned her thigh on the edge of the table, chewing gum. Not very interested, the waitress asked, "What can I get you folks?" "I'd like apple pie a la mode," said Richard, eyebrows rising in expectation, "and coffee with cream." "A la mode, eh?" asked the waitress. "Is that vanilla a la mode?" Emily saw the waitress wink at Richard and couldn't tell if the wink was camaraderie or brazen racism. "Vanilla is perfect," Richard said with a slow grin, and Emily was touched by his composure. Emily ordered a big iced tea with tuna fish sandwich on wheat, and when the waitress returned her pencil to her purplish hair and dabbed a set of studs in her ear, Emily was touched again. This woman had to be 50 years old, discouraged and tired. Her studs were crazy on a woman her age, but she made sure her jewelry looked right. When she started to leave, Emily gently took her wrist in her hand. "What?" the waitress asked, a tad defensive, but mainly bored. Emily understood. She didn't know the waitress' name, but she knew the lady. This old babe would have plugged along for years and probably had a broken house, empty now of broken children, a broken heart, and burning feet for her pains. Who could have appeared in their midst at their perfect moment, except her? Emily chuckled. "Look at us. You know what we're talking about?" she asked. The waitress frowned as she would at a deacon in church who wanted her last dollar. Cracking gum, the waitress reiterated without much interest. "What?" "We're talking about jobs," Richard told her, lifting his chin and smiling. "We're talking about races working together." He wrinkled his nose as if he had told a joke. That crazy waitress, she asked the question that completed the context. "Working together," the waitress asked. "For what?" "Exactly," Richard murmured. "We think we can make America," said Emily, "a land of all the people again." She frowned a smile, cocky and teasing, and then she pointed at the waitress. "Weary heart. If that ain't goofy enough," she said, "we think we can start right here in Buffalo." The waitress groaned, rolling her eyes at silly city kids. Cracking gum, she muttered to herself, but she didn't leave. "I've heard people talk about this, my neighbors and customers, right at these tables," she said, pointing here and there in the dining room. Then she took a deep breath and her face collapsed into what Emily knew must have been agonies. "I remember when everybody in Buffalo knew his place," the waitress said, and then her eyes wandered, searching for something. "But I remember when there was a place for everybody in Buffalo, too." Her mouth turned a funny way, and she stared long out the broad plate glass window onto Main Street. "Jobs," the waitress mumbled. "It's like I could feel my husband's arms around me right now and my baby on my shoulder." Emily had to put her hand over her mouth. "I used to have a house and a life," the waitress said. Then Emily felt her stare at two people whom she very likely saw as a spick and a nigger. And knowing what the next word signified, Emily almost cried out loud. The waitress asked, "Aren't you people too?" Her face contorted as a child's would. She was frightened and daring to, "What?" "Am I stupid?" the waitress asked, as if she were talking to the atmosphere. "South Buffalo is tough. Winter is tough. Making ends meet in this town is tough." Then she stopped, and Emily looked at Richard, because his face had changed too, and he was speaking. "Am I out of my natural mind?" he asked, and Emily wondered if he knew that he had spoken out loud. Any sane nigger wouldn't even listen to this. "I'm supposed to trust you two? I'm supposed to trust snobs in this downtown restaurant?" Then he laughed. "I hate to give up the truth," he said, As if in reply, the waitress said as a child would, "Please don't lie to me." Emily saw her blink back tears. "Are you too serious?" the waitress asked. And once again this afternoon, Emily could barely breathe. She knew that her toe was at the door of the future. She dreaded turning that knob. Whatever her councilman was using her to do, she knew that now was the time. But she had learned never to invite the people inside the room of her mind who would slam the door on her the instant another pretty face flashed $1 more. The street came back at her because the rooms she knew were in tenements. She had to make a decision. Now. She had to decide right now. "Yes," said Emily, as solemnly as she would murmur in church. "Yes, we are." Richard arched his brow and stared at the table. Then he held out his hands, palms up, as if they might have been full of promise. After a long hesitation, reluctant and wary, he said, "Yeah, we are." The waitress stood in silence, as if she felt stupid or felt an inexplicable excitement, having no idea what to say. A Catholic girl, Emily would hardly presume to know which ones were angels. "Have you blessed our conversation?" Emily asked. Richard ran a dark hand over his face and murmured, "Oh, man." "I'm Emily," said Latina, and she extended a hand. "Margie," said the waitress, accepting a handshake under a smile that wasn't sure about this exchange. But Emily held Margie's gaze and held Margie's hand, smiling, widening her eyes, and inviting Margie to relent, to believe, to join. And at length, Margie sighed. "I'm Margie Dugan," she mumbled, her voice cracking a little. "I used to be O'Malley," she cracked, as if recouping her pride. But then she acquiesced, gave it up for some reason that Emily couldn't have named under threat of harm, but that she knew was poignantly true. Margie raised her chin, lips trembling, and laid her second hand on Emily's, and the Latina hard city girl lost control of many tears. Richard exhaled a cautious breath and slowly closed his eyes, reaching a hand up to the clasped hands of the two women at his table. Nobody let on right away, but Emily heard gossip later saying that various clientele noticed Margie, overheard the chatter, and some people said that Emily's booth was brightly lit that day. Later, Emily would hear people opine that a movement was born in that booth, but she knew that was nonsense. The movement was born all over town on many days, in many places, but she heard stories later that some customers perceived a glow around an aging waitress who had dyed her hair purple, of all things. The story had a sweet warmth, and along with that warmth, Emily saw the baby in the next booth clamp fat hands in his mouth. Precisely then, when she thought that Margie was struck dumb by hope after years of gloom, and Emily wondered if the baby felt some delirious joy that he surely couldn't comprehend and could barely express. Emily believed that the infant felt what she did, that the infant was sent to her in an everyday booth over iced tea. She believed that the sudden power of innocence that day transmogrified sordid adulthood. She internalized her conviction and held her faith up to the light in her mind. Because she swore that she saw a profound metamorphosis happening, and the change was beautiful, reflecting everything that was beautiful to her. But then the baby's mommy picked him up and headed for the restroom, leaving the other woman alone in the booth for a minute. Emily figured the mom had to change the little guy. He had peed, or maybe he had dropped a happy load. Maybe the baby didn't count. Maybe the baby was coincidental, she thought later, and the glow over her booth was only gossip. On the day that Hope came to Buffalo in a diner on Main Street, who could ever tell? Thank you for coming. We have coffee and tea and books for sale. If you have comments or questions? No.
Great story.
I'm sorry?
It was a great story.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
I'm very glad you said it in Buffalo.
In Buffalo, someone from South Buffalo. Well, thank you all. Thank you for coming.